So welcome this afternoon. I am joined today with the team at INFORAFRICA with three fantastic panelists, Christelle Alvin, Olivia Brangu, and Vanessa Mungar. And we are delighted to welcome you to the Rethinking Development panel at the INFORAFRICA, where we're going to be thinking about some radical ideas about the context of development, particularly in the light of COVID-19. Development has been a post-Bretton Woods concept, post-colonial concept, and for some, this is now a tired concept. And we are now thinking more along the lines of economic growth, and certainly the Sustainable Development Goals have definitely moved people into the arena of thinking about development and growth for all, not just what were termed developing nations. So today I would like to turn to my colleagues, Christelle, Olivia and Vanessa, to share their vision of what development means to them in the 21st century, and to just tell us a little bit about who they are, what they're doing at the moment, and actually give us their vision of development. So can I turn to you, Christelle? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing today and what development means to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for including me in this panel. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Well, first, yes, my name is Christelle Alvin, and I'm working for UNCDF, the United Nations Capital Development Fund. We have a financial mandate in the UN system. I'm based in Dakar, in Senegal, and I'm coordinating the office. And basically, my role is really to develop new approaches, new programs, new ways to work and to serve the countries we are in terms of access to finance for the communities, for the local government, and for the people. Now, regarding your question about what means development to me, I think it's really looking at ownership, and to me, development is really helping anybody in one specific country to be able to take ownership of his life, and to be able to identify any opportunity and to make those opportunities a success. And that's why I think it's so important. You mentioned the SDGs. What is important is those SDGs is the kind of holistic approach that they have. So when you think about one individual, one young lady or young man, whatever, you have to think holistically. You have to think in terms of access to education, access to health, economic opportunities, environment, climate change. Everything talks to one specific person. So, and that's where I think that taking ownership and responsibility for your life means to be able to be in an environment that gives you, an enabling environment that gives you the opportunity to do so.
Thank you, Christelle. That's incredibly, talking about the holistic nature of development. It's not just, it's a holistic area of development. And can I perhaps pass now across to Vanessa to share a little bit about your current work, which I know is pretty radical, and also to share with us your big vision for development.
Thanks a lot, Dorothea, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I currently work as the Director for Gender, Women and Civil Society at the African Development Bank, which means leading our group strategy on gender equality and women's empowerment, which is basically two main things. On the one hand, mainstreaming gender, applying a gender lens to all of our operations, whether they are education, infrastructure, energy, or access to finance projects. And on the other hand, leading some of our flagship initiatives for women, in particularly one of them, which is called AFAWA, Affirmative Finance Action for Women in Africa. In addition, our second hat in the department is engaging civil society across our operations with a goal to really have more impact, to work with civil society partners as development partners, not after the fact, after the project is built, to hear about what's going wrong, but to start from the design phase, working together and ensuring we're really responding to local communities' needs. So that's what we do on a daily basis. When it comes to development, from my perspective, and it's not whether it's today working at the bank or throughout my career, it's always been about one thing, trying to extend equal access to opportunity to all. Women, men, anybody on this continent, at least as long as I'll be working for it, is how do we ensure that people have access to enablers, the basic services that, provided you have access to them, you can, as Christelle was saying, have ownership of your own life. So equal access to health, education, economic opportunity, whether you're a boy, a girl, regardless of your ethnicity or religion, is what for me development means and what we need to strive towards, so that anybody born on this continent actually has a fair shot at life.
Thank you, Vanessa, and incredibly inspiring there that what you're really saying is that there should be opportunity for all here, where it doesn't matter where you're born, you have the same opportunity for a fair shot at life as anyone else. So thank you. That's kind of readdressing the balance and very pertinent in the light of this week. And can I pass over to Olivia in Rwanda to just share a little bit about that quite innovative project I know that you all are working on there in Rwanda, and tell us a bit about your vision for development.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me on the panel. It's a pleasure to be on to discuss such an interesting topic. My name is Olivia Rubagumia. I'm the head of investor relations here at the Kigali International Financial Center, otherwise known as KIFC. We are a new international financial center. I'd like to think that we are the newest IFC in a growing ecosystem of financial centers. We seek to become the main nexus, inland hub, so to speak, for investments into Africa. So we would like to have Rwanda as a place where people can come, set up shops, set up offices, set up funds, whatever else that they would like to have domiciled, and then do business across Africa. So we are very excited to be launching this year. We're very excited to be on this panel as well, because part of the reason for the IFC is actually specifically in rethinking development. What is development to us? If you know, I'm not sure how many people know a lot about Rwanda. I know we've been in the news, but one key thing about Rwanda, and reflecting a lot of other realities across the continent, is we have an economy that's very dependent on traditional sources of revenue. These tend to be primary commodities that don't have a lot of value added. And therefore, in terms of what reimagining development could be like, what I imagine development to be like in the 21st century and onwards, is diversification of economies and higher skill sets for the continent, higher incomes, but really attracting the kind of services and activities that will wean us off what essentially does not bring back a lot and keeps us dependent in a weakened state when it comes to balancing of trade, when it comes to economic substance and the like. So in a nutshell, for me, imagining development is being able to diversify and increase the livelihood that of our people across the continent.
Thank you, Olivia. And that's just great to hear about such a radical new approach to development that not only applies to Rwanda, but the vision is to boost development across the continent by Rwanda taking that innovative first step in this direction. So, well, thank you all for your introductions and for your vision and picture of development, 3 different pictures, but all united in actually uplifting the livelihoods and the economic prosperity across the continent. How, with that in mind, COVID has had a devastating impact globally. It has destroyed, it has had an impact on economies, it has had a terrible toll on lives taken. it has yet to have the devastating impact we've seen in some European nations on the continent, although the numbers today are at least 100,000 cases on the continent. And it's now been predicted that COVID will change things forever globally, and particularly on the continent. How do you see development being impacted by this current epidemic? And what do you think will happen over the long term? Maybe I can start with Vanessa for this question.
Sure, Dorothy. Yeah, that's a tough one, right? So how are we impacted? How is our agenda being impacted? You know, as you were mentioning, I think right now the sanitary impact of the crisis to date, and I'm just saying to date because it's important to be very humble in terms of the information we really have and that we're sure of. But the sanitary impact to date has been lesser than in other regions of the world. However, we're very, very badly hit by the economic impact already. We can see it, the impact of some of the confinement measures, particularly on a continent that relies so much on small-scale services, trade, and commerce, realizing that over 40% of Africans rely on cross-border trade for their livelihoods. When you cross the borders, what happens? You know, and these are just small examples. And I mean, for us, at least at the African Development Bank, I'll give you the institutional perspective on that one, is that we've rearranged our entire work program to see, okay, how do we change everything, go back to the drawing board, and what do we need to do this year as the development institution of the continent to support countries as best as we can. And so we rapidly deployed a financing mechanism that we've called the COVID-19 Response Facility. It's a $10 billion fund that is there to help regional member countries, so all countries on the continent, to alleviate the effects of the spread of the virus on the continent. And that's both to mitigate some of the immediate effects, the liquidity needs, to meet the immediate financial needs and provide essential government services, but also to support the private sector. So these are some of the things we're doing, and we're ensuring that we're applying a gender lens to everything we do, because women have been affected differently from this crisis, you know, and we know it from previous crises. There's a disproportionate impact, health impact, yeah, and in fact, we're even seeing, for the data we have, is that in some areas, men seem to be dying more than women from COVID. However, on the other side of things, they make up the majority of our health workforce, over 90% in some of our countries, so they're more exposed and their families with them. Being at home means increased burden of all the chores you have to carry at home. It also means increased exposure to domestic violence, which in many cases affects women more than men. And I'd say also on the continent, women are most of the time in more fragile socioeconomic situations. So they're running smaller businesses with less employees, many times in the informal sector. So businesses that sometimes go by the day. And so being hit by some of these measures mean that some of them are really left hanging dry. And so the governments, ourselves, all actors are right now trying to see how to best support, both from a very macroeconomic perspective, but also at a very, very local perspective. And I think all of our responses need to specifically very deliberately target inequalities, because the crisis has exposed some structural challenges which we've been aware of, but that we still need to deal with. And I think women, for one, is one of the groups that needs to be particularly targeted in order to be an active part and an active agent of the recovery effort. And any support to economic recovery, economic measures, in particular targeted at women, will go a very long way, because our research shows that when a woman earns a revenue, she reinvests about 90% of it in the education, nutrition, and education of her family. So if you want to have impact on the community at large, this is probably one of the best investments. So I think I'll stop here because we'll talk more, but one of the first things I'd recommend is really, we need to very, very much more deliberately tackle inequalities. And I would emphasize empowering women specifically. And I'm sure we can hear from Olivia on that as well, because Rwanda, for one, is a country that has been banking on women for a while.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I'm going to just pass straight across to Olivia with that. Thank you. But I think that's a very clear message that women are to be involved in the mechanisms to tackle COVID as we stand today. So, but Olivia.
So regarding the impact, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I
the impact of COVID. So the impact of so the impact of COVID. So regarding the impact of COVID that you've seen on the development agenda from your perspective, and also the role of women in this in this crisis.
So I appreciate the reference to Vanessa. As you know, Rwanda is, we do have one of the highest number of women in leadership positions, specifically parliamentarians, and even in other sectors, private sector, public sector. There's definitely been a big push in rectifying the gender imbalance that we see in a lot of nations here in Rwanda. Now, to exactly the same point, women are also the first people to get hit with any kind of when incomes are cut, when you can no longer go out and trade, when you can no longer go out and do the job and the work that you have to do, you still have to feed children, you still have to take care of households. So a huge burden has fallen on women. I would like to maybe speak also to something that was touched upon, which is that Rwanda, like many other nations across Africa, has a very high informal sector. And therefore, we also have people who do not have a social safety net. So that's something that definitely has, you know, we have to think about that. How do we secure people? There are a few things that I have to say that have maybe, I don't know if it's lessened the impact, because some of the measures that were taken were very strong and tough. Like Rwanda was the first country to lock down. We've had some pretty strong measures, and the population in general has been really good in keeping that. So you see everybody has masks. You have certain public directives that are followed in almost all buildings, temperature checks and all the likes. But I want to mention something else, which is the fact Rwanda actually has a universal health care, which we call mutuelle. So some of that is, I want to say, is it helps in terms of securing the basic livelihoods of people. So if somebody is sick, even during the COVID era, and does not have, let's say, does not have that work, cannot go to work, they can still go to the doctor. So that does really help in terms of the basic policies that we had in place before COVID. But we are seeing, exactly to Vanessa's point, huge other gaps that are being highlighted, whether it's online learning that we can strengthen for our students who are now not going to school until September because of health concerns, all the way to how can we further digitize agriculture so that farmers can continue to sell and trade and do the work that they do, even when basic transport infrastructure and logistics is shut down. If I might maybe also touch upon the fact that Rwanda is heavily reliant on things like tourism, is very reliant on agriculture. 63% actually of our export is in agriculture. So you can imagine when we have closed borders, when we have no travel, it's a huge hit on not just SMEs who are involved in the tourist industry, but also bigger players in agriculture, in trade. So informal sector, trade sector, agriculture sector, in terms of a macro view, are hugely hit. And then in a micro view, yes, women are at the forefront, children are at the forefront. In Rwanda here, we just went through our Kwibuka period, which is a commemoration of genocide against the Tutsi of 1994. So you can imagine as well, you're dealing with that for those who are survivors, who are now seeing perhaps uncertainties in terms of jobs, in terms of future, and they're also dealing with past trauma. They're also dealing with a period of time that's very difficult. So at least for Rwanda, it's been tough psychologically, economically as well, and especially for the most vulnerable players. But there have been certain things that have been put in place, which we can speak upon when we get to that as well.
Thank you, Olivia. And I'm particularly interested in, you know, Rwanda's always seems to be at the cutting edge these days of kind of new innovations. I'm really intrigued by that Rwanda's use of robotics during the crisis. Please tell us more.
Yes.
More.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing this up. So Rwanda has been making strides in terms of diversifying its economy, of which, of course, financial services, that the sector I represent, is a part of. But other sectors that we've also been putting a lot of investment in terms of a country are tech and innovation, creating ourselves as a proof of concept country. So we have really tried to make great strides in that, which came out, and we saw some aspects of this during the COVID, the heat of the COVID pandemic and lockdown here in Rwanda. For example, we have introduced robotics, specifically robots, but robotics in healthcare. So being able to, for example, do some of the primary care that would put physicians and frontline workers in a more dangerous position to contract the virus, such as things like picking up vitals from infected patients, to being able to have digitized records as well, and healthcare. All these things had been put in place and or were coming along. So when COVID hit, we were in place to introduce robotics into the healthcare system. We had digitized and medical system already in place. Also in regards to when we think of fintech and digitization of currency, because of those strides, we've managed to be cashless. That's been a big encouragement. So that saves money in the long terms in terms of a country. In terms of a public health issue, it's a big gain as well, because people are not exchanging currencies. And also in creating efficiency in that sense. Another aspect of where we've introduced technology and robotics is in our use of drones. So for example, during the lockdown, people could not travel to, you can travel to the doctor, but if you are from a different province, you cannot travel between provinces and between towns. So you find that certain people who were already under certain kind of medical courses, such as people who have cancer, who have to follow a strict course of medication and healing, people who were maybe pregnant, people who needed certain kinds of special medicines. We used drones to reach them. So drones were going all over the countries, delivering medicine, delivering certain kinds of other essential items. So that was another use of technology and robotics. And also in relaying the messages, right? Going, there's places that are hard to reach. There's places that you don't want to even move to. You don't want to infect people. So we had the use of drones to clearly reach areas that are harder to reach, perhaps in rural areas, in neighborhoods. So we've managed to implement these during the COVID era, and really found that it was. It's very much, I think, the future and one of the solutions that we can continue to adopt after this pandemic, it passes. Yeah.
Thank you, Olivia, for just sharing some of the kind of radical innovations that have happened to tackle the virus. And a crisis is a time.
Hi, Dorothea.
A crisis is a time.
Hello?
That you can really make a big difference. So yes, thank you for that. Christelle, can I ask you the same question about the impact that you have seen of COVID-19 on the development agenda on the continent, and some of the examples of kind of good practice that you think may go into the long term?
Oh yes, sure. Yeah, and thank you for this question. That's I think that, well, first, we've seen that most of the African countries have tried to find their own solution and to really move their own way. And there has been a lot of innovation during those times. I mean, in terms of access to education, access to health, new social protection scheme, new ways to communicate to the population, new ways to support the private sector and the small SMEs. So there has been a broad range of innovation in many, many different countries in many different ways. Some of them may have worked, some others have not worked, but at least we can say that indeed the COVID has created a kind of immense laboratory across the African countries in terms of finding their own solution and experiencing some solution. As Olivia was saying, indeed the digital was part of that, and countries are more or less advanced, but indeed we have tried many. I mean, for instance, in Senegal, there has been solutions in terms of access to training and to course classes across the TV or with the digital solution, etc. So indeed, there has been a lot of innovation in terms of access to services and ways to communicate to the population, as well as way to support the private sector. But maybe one thing that also has changed a lot with the COVID is the fact that, I mean, at least for West Africa, I think we have seen different waves, in the sense that the first immediate answer from the government was to find national solutions and to put in place some lockdown and to make sure that people are safe. Confinement measures have been put in place. People are not allowed to go in the street and to go to work and all of that. And finally, after a few weeks, most of the government realized that, because also of the social pressure and demonstration, that this is not sustainable. And there is the new balance to find between the lockdown, or the way to protect the population, and to unlock a little bit the economy and remove some of the economic restriction and restriction in terms of movement, all of that. And finally, they also realized that the solutions are local. The pandemic is global, that's right, and all countries are interconnected, but at the same time, we need to find some solutions that are going to come from the communities. And most of the government have moved, I mean, Ghana, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Niger, and so on, have removed the lockdown and moving to different type of strategy where they try to involve the community, work with the local authorities, work with the local actors in order to disseminate the information, to put in place mechanism for the health sector, for education, to make sure that there is a responsibility that is taken by those local community and those local actors. So to me, I think that this COVID-19 has probably put up front not only the role of the woman, and I fully agree with that, and the role of the social protection and resilience, but also the fact that local is part of the solution. There are community-based solutions that needs to be put into account or in place, and that the national government needs to delegate or to transfer responsibility as well as means to implement those responsibility to those local community. And this is a big shift that I hope will going to continue after the end of the crisis. But and something else also regarding this territorial dimension is that you cannot apply across the country the same solution everywhere. Why? Because this virus and the pandemic hits the community in different ways, in different communities, in different villages. So in some cases, you are right in the middle of the crisis. In other, you are before the crisis and you need to protect the population. In other cases, you are after the crisis. So depending on where you stand when the virus hits the community, you need to adapt the solution. So there is not one tailored approach, one single approach, but you need tailored approach, and also you need to tailor depending on the time. So there is a lot of variability in terms of geography and in terms of time and response from the governments, and especially the local governments on this.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. I mean, really, really incredible contribution about about thinking locally and dealing with this locally and moving the resources down locally to have the greatest impact. So thank you. That's an incredible response to that.
May I add something to that?
Yes.
I really like and appreciate that aspect, and I just want to use something that might illustrate it regarding the local solutions, and really, I think it ties in also to perhaps how I see development in the future, right? For it to also incorporate these homegrown solutions that all the countries are discovering or have already been in place. I'll give you a good example. One of the homegrown solutions in Rwanda involves in creating communities, right? Sectors. You may have heard of Umuganda, which is the last Saturday of the month. Community comes together and does community work. But it's based off a structure whereby each neighborhood, each community is mapped out they have a leader, they have a sector. We basically know almost where everybody is, right? It was a way to reintegrate the community post-genocide, right? Have neighbors talking to neighbors together, finding development and solutions when you don't have the money, when you don't have the aid, but you do have neighbors. It was leveraging the traditional concept of what we call a budehe, which is collective action altogether. But what it essentially happened was that when COVID hit, we realized that we knew who all our vulnerable families were in one sector, because that had been recorded. That had been part of the way we created and formed our communities. So when it came to relief, and part of the COVID was bringing food distribution and relief to poor and vulnerable families, people already knew, could go to the sector leader and they said, okay, I know so-and-so here, so-and-so there, so these guys are the vulnerable. So it really helped when it came to food distribution, when it came to organization, to responding to those people who do not have a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks to find a solution. And that came from a homegrown solution. So that's what I wanted to support in terms of rethinking development with the input of local communities, of grassroots activism and movements, because if and such global pandemics, global challenges arrive, again, that local framework can help source the solution quite quickly.
Olivia, thank you. That is such a really helpful contribution to giving us a real case study of how that has made a difference using local concepts and local ideas. And we have something similar in the Caribbean called jollification, which I'm sure has an African heritage of everyone coming together, turning over the land together, eating together, and then they move to the next village and do the same thing. It sounds like a very similar heritage.
Yeah, that's exactly where it comes from. That's exactly what it used to do. Yeah.
Very similar heritage. And I'm seeing a lot of this, in particular, maybe I want to move this into a conversation about, as we are a panel of women, over to Vanessa about some of the kind of solutions that they have seen that have taken place from women on the ground in terms of addressing the virus, because I know that there's some great innovations that have come out from the kind of approach that they've taken. So perhaps Vanessa can share those with us. Oh, we've lost your sound. I think we've slightly lost your sound. Okay. Let me see if the producers can.
Maybe can I just say a word regarding what?
And we'll work on the sound.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So, and I think Wanda is a very good example, not only on the community-based approach or solution, but also in the sense that because you've put in place this kind of contract between the national government and the local authority, it's also a way to diversify the public solutions that you put in place, depending on the variation of the reality and the needs from the communities. So you have also created a very powerful tool in terms of diversification of public solution and public policies across the territories. That is also very interesting. Over.
Thank you, Christelle. That is super helpful in terms of a contribution about thinking about this in a very, very different way. I think we will be joined shortly again by our colleague Vanessa with some sound. But I think I would be really interested to hear from you. I'll go back to you, Christelle, about the role of women in the crisis and where you've seen some kind of gender innovations in terms of the crisis.
Thank you. I think that the role of women, I'm not a gender specialist, but obviously, I mean, this is right that women, and especially in the economic sector, have been hit much more than the men, especially because they are in the informal sector and they have, they are really doing their economic activity on a daily basis. And this has hit them a lot. I mean, this COVID, while their need is also increasing because they are taking care of the children, they are taking care of health, of education, and all of that. So the impact, because of the women have been impacted, is even more important. So if there is something to be focused on, this is indeed in terms of social protection solution, to really find tailored solution for women, especially those ones evolving in the what we call informal sector, which I don't like this name, because in the end, most of those women are paying a lot in terms of informal taxes, let's say, than men, but they are still not benefiting from very few of the public offer in terms of social protection. So yeah, I think that's an important point. And when you look at, I mean, there is a picture that I like very much. This is the comparison when going back to the local development, when you look at the role of the woman and the role of men. Take one municipal council, and you will all see men, maybe not in Rwanda, but in many African countries, and look at the market, and then you have only women. So you can see that the economy is really run by women, while at the same time, the political and this decision-making process is done by men. So there is really here a divide and a gap that we need to address when it comes to gender. And it's not a matter of women, it's really a matter of gender and equity.
Thank you, Christelle. And I think that's a really good note to pass over to our colleague Vanessa, really, about the transformation as we build back. And I think we move into the last question about building back better, the role of women that she sees in building back better post the COVID crisis. I thoroughly believe in never wasting a crisis. It's an opportunity to do radical policy development and implement radical ideas whilst everyone is focused on addressing the crisis. So perhaps if we can pass over to Vanessa to talk a little bit about the building back better, and definitely the role of women in building back better post this crisis, where we rethink development. Vanessa.
Thanks, Dorothea. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, super. Well, the role of women on different levels, obviously. The number one is going to be on the economic tissue, and really the support that we are focusing on providing to the small and medium enterprises, and seeing how they'll be able to be part of the Build Back Better. In particular, one thing we're trying to tackle with our FAWA program is the issue of women being perceived as riskier in general already, due to a number of factors: lack of information about them, lack of disaggregated data, the fact that they operate in the informal sector, but also the fact that they lack collateral in many instances. So we've developed a program that really aims at doing that, providing credit guarantee in addition to other capacity building activities and other things, and technical assistance to the banks, by the way, because it's not just the women who need to be reinforced, but the banks as well, so they understand that there is business to be made. But anyways, what we fear is that the banking sector is likely to be even more risk averse after this. So there might be even more need for extending support, particularly to the smaller businesses. And one of our biggest effort is going to be on another expression I don't like, bottom of the pyramid, because we all have great financing mechanisms, but that still, at the end of the day, benefit somehow established businesses that might or might not have been able to access the funding regardless of its existence. But how do we support the people that really don't have access to the traditional bank? The women that just need to buy a small machine to transform their inputs, let's say tomatoes, into juice or paste, and that's so that they can be a bit more profitable, maybe create one job. And if we can manage to support people at that level, then we'll be doing development differently. Another aspect is to focus much more broadly on human development. We've had a tendency on the continent to really prioritize infrastructure investment. And we see it even in our requests from countries, as the African Development Bank. At the end of the day, we only support and respond to countries' demands. Yes, we discuss with them to try and together identify the best priorities, but it comes down to their own priorities and their own development agenda. And so when you look at the end of the day, at least pre-COVID, we still had about 70% of our requests on major infrastructure projects. So really, I think this is a proof that we must focus much more on human-centered development, investing in our people. Even when you look at infrastructure, health infrastructure in particular, the crisis has exposed the fact that we need to really drive much more investment in that sphere. And so that's one of the things to be done differently. Another one, I think we lack financing mechanisms for small scale solutions. You know, in the development landscape, and that's some of the points that Christelle and Olivia were making, amazing local solutions, and local can be national, but sometimes even at the community level, a small NGO that's doing something great for the people in that village. Yet we as a development ecosystem don't really have mechanisms, ways. We know how to invest 100 million or unlock that much, but how to unlock $1,000 or $10,000 at the village level. And I think that kind of innovation we need. And the last piece is on the leadership we need. You know, I've been really thinking about the concept of solidarity, and we've seen huge solidarity levels at the community level, within countries, within cities, people supporting each other, their neighbors, you know, cheering for the workforce in hospitals, etc. Amazing. Now, how do we extend this solidarity beyond our borders? Because this has shown us that, you know, none of us is safe until one of us, even if it's at the other end of the world, is not. It's always been the case. It's not new with COVID. But, you know, sometimes you need these kinds of things to realize that, wow, we're all crying people we love for the same reasons. So how do we extend that solidarity? How do we coordinate globally better? How do we show more compassion, participation, etc.? And on that point, I would tend to say, you know, diversity in leadership will help us do that too. You know, having more women around the table, having more, and it's not just diversity of gender, diversity overall, you know, leadership bodies that represent at all levels, not just national governments, but even local, etc., that represent the communities that they're trying to serve, so that we can ensure that everyone's perspectives are taken into account when we make those big decisions that are going to impact entire communities. But yes, more women in leadership at all levels, I think, can help us towards more solidarity and more compassion as well.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thank you so much. And let me pass across to Olivia to say, and when we talk about women in leadership, they've got a great track record in Rwanda. So well, how would you build back better, and the role of women in building back better? This is the last question for everybody.
So I appreciate the question, and I appreciate even the position, being able to speak after Vanessa and Christelle, because I feel like we're continuing the same theme, and it's leading up to perhaps some of my ideas as well. So I appreciate it. I would say that the points that were raised are 100%. I feel are what we're facing reality on the ground across the continent, whether you're in Rwanda, whether you're in Ivory Coast. We're facing a lot of the similar solutions. We know we're capable. The narrative of having the intellectual or somebody from abroad having to come and be able to provide solutions for you. We know as a country, especially as Rwanda, for example, a lot of the growth and development that happened had to start internally, right? When we had no money, very little financing, we're not interesting to anybody. We don't have oil, we don't have diamonds, you know? So it was really an investment into the human capital. And having done that, we also realize and notice exactly what my colleagues have mentioned. You can unlock the human capital, but how do you fund and empower the human capital after that, right? So in terms of what I see, you know, rethinking what's happening with what happened with COVID, it's really taken, it's paused, it's made us pause, take a step back, and have to reimagine. Rwanda was on a trajectory for a 10% growth, for example, this year. We're down to 3.5% GDP growth. That's a huge loss. But it's a moment to have to stop and say, okay, how do we do things, and how do we do things different? And perhaps, how can we do it in a way that, to what my colleagues encompassed, rely on integration, in collaboration, because Rwanda is a landlocked country, for example. For us to receive the protective equipment that some of our friends and donors outside sent us, it had to go through another country. It went through Ethiopia sent to Kigali. That's an example of integration and collaboration that the continent exhibited, right? And it wasn't just Rwanda, it was Kenya, it was Senegal, and we saw a lot of that. Even the scientists that were cross-referencing each other across Africa, when they're trying to unlock the DNA behind COVID. So I feel that what we would like to see and what we would like to leverage and I think will reimagining the world is increased integration and collaboration by African, in the African continent, meaning whether it's trade, scientific knowledge, resource sharing, you know, we really double down on that. Yes, we have our local, but we have our regional partners that we can also leverage before having to reach across, you know, vast seas and oceans. We're in it together, and we have shown goodwill to each other. Again, Rwanda is landlocked. We are highly dependent on our neighbors for, you know, foodstuffs, for imports, what have you, and that wasn't cut off. So that speaks to the level of integration and collaboration Africa can have. Now, if I might take a step further, to add on to what our colleague said, on the ground, we have a number of institutions, agencies, individuals, and communities doing wonderful things, but how are they, what are the avenues for them to link back into global markets, into unlocking capital, in being able to access finance? And to your point, not from just the big institutions that are known, but how can it trickle down to the village level, to across even sectors where maybe an investor might be nervous to go, but the activity that he's doing, whether it's philanthropic perhaps, maybe it's fintech, would provide a solution to this community. So what we see here is the role of KIFC, and why I'm passionate about this project is that we don't see ourselves as building an ecosystem for Rwanda only. What we're seeing is that this ecosystem needs to be able to serve across Africa, be able to create and allow people to imagine new vehicles of bringing liquidity and capital and ideas to other places and across the regions in Africa. So I'll give you a good example. For example, in the KIFC, the Kigali International Financial Center, one of the tenants partners that we have here is a group called Kalana. And these guys are a fund specifically focused on financing SMEs. And this is a fund that could work across the continent. But what has happened traditionally, and is still the case, is a lot of that capital and money is domiciled somewhere abroad, right? The projects are here. I think I was reading somewhere like 45% of impact investment is geared towards Africa, but less than 16% of those funds are in Africa. So what happens when you're far away from your market, when you're far away from communities that you can and should be working closely with? It creates a lag time, it creates a lot of other issues, cost effectiveness, risk and liability that increases, and that's what we want to cut off. So we are trying to provide macro solutions and look at macro solutions to liquidity, to financing, to capital unlocking. So another example would be RH Buffalo. These guys are a healthcare fund based in South Africa. They recently listed in the Rwanda Stock Exchange because of the financial center incentives and environment that we're creating. But these guys are specifically looking into healthcare solutions, and they're trying to leverage capital for healthcare work and solutions that they're doing across the continent. And last but not least, I'm going to highlight another great tenant that's coming in called Westbridge that is specifically looking to financing real estate and home ownership in Africa. So again, moving away from the traditional concepts of AIDS, meaning, you know, charity perhaps and philanthropy, there is not saying that it's wrong, there is definitely still a big need for this, but now I think we need to look at how do we bring this capital, because the capital is out there. I like to say the money didn't burn up, right? COVID didn't make the money disappear, but what it is, it's there. But this is an opportunity to redirect that needed in a way that is not in a nationalistic sense, but for us to think of it in terms of a broader continental, not just Pan-African, but human sense, really. So that's my response to that.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you that's unlocking capital, which is really seeming to be a theme of this, and not for the major projects, but actually unlocking capital for human development. And with that comment, can I pass to Christelle, but to make the final contribution here on how do we build back better and the role of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, I mean, unlocking capital is something that is key to make sure that development can happen. And it is true that we won't be able to achieve development through only through aid or through philanthropic, even if it's very important for some area and for some least developed countries. But I fully agree, and this is also something that UNCDF is working on. That we need to put in place some de-risking mechanism, investment vehicle that are able to bring additional funding to the ground. I mean, we talk about local development. So local development, it's about accessing to finance on the ground, for private finance, also for PPPs, for public and private partnerships, especially involving municipalities as well as local sponsor. I think that it's very important to help those specific potential investment. There are a lot of ideas, there are a lot of very good initiatives, but if they do not access to finance, it will be very difficult to make them concrete. So that's one key element, and looking finance, developing blended finance solution, and of course, unfortunately, with the situation and the drop into the in terms of economic rate and GDP, makes this path that we are engaging on in terms of blended finance involving the private sector more and more difficult to reach. But I mean, the agenda is still there. The other point to me is two key actors that have not been taken into account. I mean, this unlocking finance is the how, but there is also the who. And on the who, I think that we really need to think differently development in terms of, it has always been a discussion between government, national government, and always, you know, transfer of funds or support, etc., through national government. I think that there are other actors that needs to be at the table. One are the municipalities, the local authorities. This was my point before regarding the need to have community-based solution and actors that are legitimate and be able to represent the communities in order to have the global dialogue across municipalities and local authorities, and also the private sector. And when we talk about the private sector, I mean, it's not the private sector like the big companies, but it's really, Africa is full of economic initiatives that are not taken as the private sector or SME. So how to involve private initiative, community-based initiative, especially when it comes to this meso level, and how can we be able to reinforce this meso level? We talk about women, so how to help them to capitalize their economic activities, how to make sure that we are not only looking at very nuclear economic activities, but ways to put together initiative and then to create those small, medium enterprises that are going to be transformative and be able to deliver services. Some of those services can be delivered indeed through the private sector, I mean the health, or to PPPs, and then accessing for municipalities to additional funding through PPPs. We want, I mean, there is no possibility, we know it now, that the municipalities will receive from the national government enough funding to achieve the SDGs. So they need additional funds, will be available in the banks, in the domestic banks, in the international bank, but they need to have the knowledge and the capacity to structure their PPPs in a way that they can deliver the services and be responsible for the money they can borrow and that they can reimburse. So, yeah, I mean, the COVID, I hope, is going to accelerate a little bit this discussion about community ownership, the role of women, the role of social protection, in a way where we can have innovative solutions to unlock blended finance and innovative financial solutions for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Krista. And I think you really summed up really what the real themes of this conversation has been today in terms of blended finance solutions, opportunities for better access to finance across the board, not for just 100 million, but smaller amounts, access for communities, local solutions, applying those local solutions across the continent, looking at local innovations and applying those across the continent, sharing knowledge and sharing information across borders, more diverse leadership, so women leaders, and I certainly heard that was a theme, and access to resources, finance and solutions for women as well. So I just really want to say thank you. You all have really brought it home today about the new way to rethink development. I'm delighted that on this panel we've heard very little about the words aid or the word development. We have heard about human-centered development and financial and capital approaches to development and economic growth and prosperity. So I would really like to thank you all, Christelle, Olivia, and Vanessa, for your contribution today as we go ahead and rethink development in the new post-COVID era for the continent. Thank you all. Thank you for your time this afternoon.